On today's episode of Cuba to You, I detail for you, wow, low battery now, wow. On today's episode of Cuba to You, I detail for you, in summary, the storied baseball history in Cuba. So baseball is a national sport in Cuba. It's probably one of the more famous sports. It's number one, I would say. It's baseball, boxing, dominoes, a little bit of wrestling. Actually, a lot of bit of wrestling. Very huge wrestling background culture in Cuba. But baseball is huge. Just to give you a summary, and this is, I'm telling you, bare bones, skeletal summary of baseball in Cuba. It started way back in the 1800s. It was brought back from a Cuban who went and studied in Alabama and was just in Alabama, and he saw this game played with bats and baseballs and brought it back, and that is where it began. Literally all the way back in the 1800s. This is a sport that has been ingrained, embedded in the culture. The Cubans are very knowledgeable about baseball, and they're very historically well versed on different players, on just all the Cubans that have left the island and joined the big leagues. And that community stays tight to this day. All the Cuban players in the league are pretty tight with each other because they know that they've come from a similar place. The Cuban baseball team, the national baseball team, even with all of the restrictions that there are in Cuba, and even with the lack of, they don't have the world-renowned facilities that the US has and maybe other countries have, but they've had a lot of success in baseball. Here are just some brief stats about the success that they've had. That success has carried over to the United States. And in the MLB, in the major leagues of baseball in this country, Cubans tend to do very well. They tend to rise and become all-stars and have long, legendary careers. These are players who learned to play since they were little kids in Cuba, and they brought this talent over, and it literally, they added something to the sport. Like most Latin American countries add to the sport, they added their piece of the puzzle, and they were very influential on the game as well. Here are just a couple of some of the greatest Cuban baseball players to ever play in the league, and you might recognize some of these faces and names. I mean, this dates back to the 80s, 90s. Even today, you have some dominant forces in the major leagues who are Cuban, and a lot of these kids grew up. Like, for example, I'm wearing Jose Fernandez's jersey. Jose Fernandez was an ace pitcher for the Marlins who tragically lost his life, and two others who were with him on that boat lost their lives. But before he died, Jose Fernandez was a strong symbol for Cuban baseball and also for Cuban exile. Jose Fernandez came on a boat. He used to play baseball in Cuba with a rock and sticks, okay? He defected when he was, I believe, 15 years old, and they caught him and brought him back to Cuba and put him in jail, and actually told him he could never play on the national team again. And he tried again to leave, and when he was finally successful and he made it, he actually came to Tampa, which is where I am, and he went to, I believe, Alonzo High in Tampa and became a standout pitcher. And then the Marlins drafted him, and he had an amazing first few years in the league. I mean, he was on pace to be one of the best pitchers ever before his tragic passing. And that is just an example of, and his story is a lot more in depth and complex, but that is just an example of how recent we have Cuban players who are literally coming on boats to play, to accomplish their dream of playing at the highest level. Yasiel Puig is another example. The hell he had to go through to get to this country to play baseball. His story is insane, going through Mexico, literally being sold like bounty by the cartels in Mexico just to be able to get to the US and do this, play baseball in this country. In the only country not the only country, I won't say, but the best country when it comes to freedom and the ability to just do the things you want to do. If you have a product and you offer it out to the community and they want to buy it, they're going to buy it. That is the beauty of America. And so that is just a summary of how important baseball is to Cubans. This could be a 50-minute video about the intricacies and the history, but just know this. In Cuba, baseball is ingrained in the culture. It is very much a national sport. Similar to how baseball is here, but over here, basketball, football, we have a lot of sports that everybody celebrates. Over there, it's like baseball's huge. I mean, you play since you're a little kid. And there is actually, this was on, I believe it was Anthony Bourdain. I don't think it was Anthony Bourdain's show. It might have been. there was a show where he's in Cuba, and there is literally a corner, a street corner in Havana, I believe. I might be wrong about all of these details, but I know that there is a street corner in Cuba where you literally have to have a card to enter, and it's like a park, and all they do all day is debate baseball, debate Cuban players, who's the best player here. You know, they just literally talk about baseball. They love it, they're passionate about it. And Cubans in Miami and Cubans in Tampa and just Cubans all around the world are also passionate about it because it's a part of their culture. Even if they're not diehard fans of their teams, they just remember, they have those fond memories of listening to Felo Ramirez do the games, you know, like announce the games in Spanish on Radio Mambi, which is what I grew up listening to. All right, and this is before I even really knew Spanish. I was just listening to it, and I can repeat all the things he would say. I remember every time the guy would start to pitch, he would go, lanza. Lanza. Batazo alto, largo por el field. La bola se va elevando. Which means pitch. But the way he said it was just, it's like if somebody were to be standing there and say, and like an English person were to say, pitch. It just makes no sense to somebody, but for me it's like, oh, I guess it's so cool. Like he's literally breaking down the motion for you. Anyway, the point is, it's very much ingrained in our culture. So don't be surprised if you see Cubans, you know, in baseball. If you're wondering where they coming from, they're coming from the island. They play a very high level of baseball over there because they have to learn from when they're little. And a lot of them are learning and becoming so great with very limited resources. So imagine when they get to the league and they get all this access to world-class facilities, they become excellent. They become legendary. As I've shown you earlier, some of the legends that have graced the game. So there's your basic little summary of what is the connection between baseball and Cubans. Started all the way back in the 1800s, brought Cuba over to baseball. Since then, they've competed in national competition and been very successful. A lot of those players have come to the major leagues and had storied careers. And even to this day, some of today's players are Cuban, and some of them are some of the best players in the league, getting paid a lot of money to play baseball. You know, where they once played on the street or played with sandals or played with, you know, with limited access or for not a lot of money. Now they're getting paid millions. It's beautiful. It's something all Cubans should celebrate. If you like this video, go ahead and click like on the video, subscribe, and hit the little bell so you don't miss out on anything in the future. And yeah, besides that, you have a nice day.